Amiri Williams never sought conflict, but in places like this, conflict had a way of finding you, creeping up like a slow-moving storm, distant thunder rolling just beneath the surface of everyday life. Iron Root wasn't just a barbershop, it was a symbol, a statement, a place where black men and women could walk in, sit down, and feel human, seen, valued. She had spent years building it from nothing, pouring in every ounce of sweat, every dollar, every sleepless night into making it stand. But now, that foundation was shaking, the cracks forming where she least wanted them, at the hands of men who thrived on fear. The first sign had been subtle, a presence she could feel before she saw it. Young men idling across the street, their eyes lingering too long on the shop, their postures too relaxed, too deliberate. She knew the game. First they watched. Then they tested. And then, if you let them, they took. She had seen it happen to others, had watched businesses fold under the weight of veiled threats, had heard the stories of shop owners who didn't want trouble, who thought maybe if they paid, maybe if they kept their heads down, it would all go away. But Amiri wasn't one of them. She never had been. And J-Roc must have known that, because the second sign was louder. That morning, a brick lay inside the shop, nestled in a bed of shattered glass, the front window reduced to jagged teeth. The air smelled of cold dust and city grime, the silence that followed heavier than the damage itself. She stared at the words scrawled in red across the wall. Ping, a single command, simple, direct, the kind of message that left no room for misinterpretation. Behind her, Nia sucked in a breath, a sharp inhale that carried all the unspoken fear neither of them wanted to voice. "This ain't some kids playing games," she said, her voice low, edged with the kind of anger that comes from knowing exactly how powerless you are against the rules of the street. "You know who did this?" Amiri said nothing at first, just knelt, the broom handle gripped so tightly in her hands that her knuckles burned. She swept slow, methodical, every stroke across the floor measured, controlled. Showing anger gave them what they wanted. Showing fear made them believe they'd already won. So instead, she breathed, let the glass scrape against the dustpan, let the weight of the moment settle into something firm inside her chest. "I know," she finally said, voice even, steady, as if the answer was the simplest thing in the world. The door chimed open, and before she even looked up, she knew who it was. Heavy boots, controlled steps, a presence that filled the room like a warning before a single word was spoken. Marcus scanned the damage with a slow shake of his head, his broad shoulders tensed beneath his leather jacket. "Damn," he muttered, running a hand over his beard. "That didn't take long." Amiri met his gaze, dark brown eyes locking onto his, unflinching, unreadable. "You knew it was coming." He exhaled through his nose, arms crossing over his chest, a slow nod of reluctant agreement. "Yeah," he admitted. "I just hoped we'd have more time." The problem with time was that it never worked in your favor when you needed it most. Outside, the sun had barely risen, the street already alive with movement, people passing by, cars honking in the distance, life moving on as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. A line had been drawn, and Amiri was standing on the wrong side of it. Marcus glanced toward the window, the jagged edges of the broken glass catching the light. "You call the cops?" The dry chuckle that left her lips wasn't real humor, just an echo of frustration wrapped in something bitter. "And tell them what?" she said, brushing stray shards off her palm. "That J-Roc wants my money? That I don't have proof? They'll tell me to file a report, and when nothing happens, I'll have to clean up another mess just like this one." Marcus didn't argue because there was nothing to argue. They both knew how it worked. Cops only showed up when the blood was already on the pavement, and even then, only if it was someone worth protecting. Nia leaned against the counter, arms folded tight across her chest, her expression a mask of reluctant resignation. "So what's the plan, boss?" The words sat heavy between them. Boss. Not just a title but a challenge, a question, a demand for leadership when none of them knew exactly what the next step should be. Amiri let her gaze sweep over the shop, the chairs, the mirrors, the space she had built with her own hands. Iron Root wasn't just walls and a business license. It was defiance. It was a refusal to bow. She met their eyes, let them see the decision before she spoke it out loud. "We keep working." Marcus let out a slow breath, shaking his head, not in disagreement but in understanding. You know this isn't over. Amiri nodded once, the weight of the truth settling into her bones like an old, familiar ache. I know. The fight had just begun. The pressure started the moment the sun rose over the city, casting long shadows on the pavement, but bringing no warmth to the air thick with tension. Customers still walked into Iron Root, but something had shifted. Their movements were tighter, their words shorter, their glances sharper. They didn't linger like they used to. The usual laughter, the easy banter between barber and client, the sense of comfort, gone. Instead, eyes darted toward the front window, toward the figures leaning casually against the wall outside. They weren't doing anything, not really, just standing there, smoking, talking, watching. But their presence alone spoke louder than words. Amiri saw it, felt it, the slow tightening in her chest, the way her fingers tapped against the wooden counter in a steady, measured rhythm, the only outward sign of the frustration burning inside her. She caught the hesitation in the way old Mr. Hollis, one of her longest-running clients, paused before stepping inside, his hand lingering on the door handle just a second too long. He gave her a look as he entered, a quiet warning in his aged brown eyes. You got trouble, girl, he murmured under his breath, sliding into the chair, his voice barely more than a whisper. Amiri didn't flinch, didn't let her expression shift. She just nodded at Marcus, who had already taken position behind the chair, clippers humming low and steady in his hand. Ain't nothing I can't handle, she said, voice smooth, unshaken. But the lie felt thin. Nia noticed too. She had been quiet all morning, her usual sharp energy replaced with something tight, restrained. When the last customer left, she turned to Amiri, arms crossed, frustration carved into every tense muscle in her frame. This ain't gonna stop, she said, voice low but fierce. You think people gonna keep coming if they feel like they gotta look over their shoulder every time they walk in here? Amiri exhaled through her nose, rubbing a hand along her jaw. I know what they're doing, Nia. But I'm not folding. Yeah. Nia stepped closer, her voice rising just a notch. And what if they stop playing nice? What if next time it's not just standing outside? What if it's a bat to the window while somebody's still in here? What if... They're testing her, Marcus cut in, voice calm, deliberate, the way only a man who had seen real war could be. They want to see how far they can push before she breaks. Amiri met his gaze. Then let's make sure they realize I don't. That night, the message changed. She had locked up late, sitting at the counter long after closing, staring at the boarded-up window, at the space where glass used to be, where sunlight used to spill in and warm the floorboards. She had known it was coming. But knowing didn't make it easier when the sound of shattering glass split the quiet. She was on her feet before she even registered the movement, fingers curling into fists, pulse hammering in her ears. The wall outside, once clean, now bore a fresh wound, spray paint, bold and crude, dripping down in jagged letters. Pay or burn. The rage hit first, hot and sharp. Then came the exhaustion, heavier than the bricks they had thrown. By the time the sun rose again, Detective Burns was leaning against his car outside Iron Root, a fresh cup of coffee in one hand, the other tucked into his pocket, his expression unreadable behind the calm, almost friendly way he watched her. She didn't bother greeting him. You here to do your job or waste my time? Burns took a slow sip of coffee, unbothered, his gaze flicking to the fresh vandalism on the wall. Depends, he said. You ready to be smart about this yet? Her fingers curled against her palm. I don't pay for what's already mine. Burns sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher. And here I was thinking you had sense. He gestured lazily toward the damage. You know how this works, Amiri. Give them what they want, and they leave you alone. You fight? They push back harder. She didn't blink. Let them. Burns studied her, then let out a quiet chuckle. Tough act, he murmured. Hope it holds up when this place is nothing but ashes. And just like that he walked away, his meaning clear. This wasn't just a warning. It was a countdown. J-Roc's presence filled the shop before he even stepped inside. Outside, his men leaned against parked cars, their arms crossed, their gazes fixed on the entrance. Some smoked, others tapped fingers against their thighs, restless but patient, making sure their presence was felt. The customers inside Iron Root noticed. Eyes flickered toward the windows, hands hesitated near their wallets, conversations dropped into hushed murmurs. The once familiar space now carried an edge of unease, like a storm brewing just beyond the walls. When the door finally swung open, the shop seemed to shrink. J-Roc entered first, his movements slow and deliberate, a man accustomed to walking into rooms and owning them without needing permission. His posture radiated confidence, the kind that came from years of getting what he wanted without asking twice. Behind him, 3 of his men followed, not speaking, not posturing, just waiting. The silence they carried with them was louder than words. Amiri didn't stop working. Her hands remained steady, clippers humming against the soft curl of a client's fade. The weight of the moment pressed against her spine, but she refused to acknowledge it. Her focus stayed on her craft, on the precision of her movements, on not giving him the reaction he wanted. Around her, the other barbers barely moved, but their tension was palpable. Nia's grip on her comb tightened, her shoulders drawn back. Marcus, near the back wall, stood with his arms crossed, body poised, always calculating. J-Roc didn't rush. He let his fingers drift across the edge of an empty barber chair, his gaze sweeping the shop like an appraiser sizing up property. His lips curled slightly, his teeth flashing gold for a brief second. A slow tap of his knuckles against the counter punctuated the heavy quiet. His head tilted just slightly, an unspoken statement, a challenge wrapped in something that almost looked like amusement. He didn't need to stay long. His presence alone did the work. He turned toward the door, moving with the same deliberate ease, his crew falling in behind him. At the threshold, Dre, the quietest of the group, lingered just long enough to drag his thumb across his throat in a slow, deliberate motion before stepping outside. The shop remained frozen even after the door swung shut. The hum of clippers resumed first, followed by the soft scrape of a broom against the tile floor. The tension didn't dissipate, it simply settled, sinking into the bones of the space, taking root. Outside, the street was too still. The only movement came from an unmarked car parked just down the block, the dull gleam of sunlight catching against the windshield. Amiri stepped outside, her pulse steady, her footsteps measured. She already knew who was inside. Burns sat in the driver's seat, one arm draped lazily over the steering wheel, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of the visor. The window rolled down just enough to let the heat escape. His fingers tapped against the dashboard, his posture relaxed, but his eyes told a different story. He had been there the whole time. Watching. Waiting. Not interfering. The tension between them wasn't new. It sat there, heavy and unspoken, stretching back through years of small betrayals and quiet compromises. He didn't need to say anything. The weight of his silence carried enough meaning. She waited. He exhaled, ran a hand over his face, rolled his shoulders like the weight of something unseen pressed against them. A muscle ticked in his jaw, a small crack in the carefully placed detachment. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. His car pulled away, slow and smooth, tires rolling against the pavement without urgency. That night, fire licked against the edges of the dumpster behind Iron Root. Flames curled upward, casting shadows against the brick, the heat distorting the air. The fire never reached the shop. It was never meant to. The message had already been delivered. Marcus had always been a man of action. While others hesitated, weighed risks, debated the best course, he moved. He saw problems like puzzles, with solutions just waiting to be pieced together. That's why, when the fire flickered behind Iron Root, casting jagged shadows against the walls, he didn't waste time with frustration or fear. He called it what it was, a test, a warning, and immediately started planning. His idea was simple: watch them, track them, expose them. He wanted evidence, something undeniable, something that couldn't be brushed aside or buried. Surveillance wasn't just about gathering proof, it was about control. If they knew what J-Roc was doing before he did it, they wouldn't be reacting, they'd be countering. He spoke fast, laying it all out, his voice low but firm. Cameras, hidden angles, positioning. The way they could use the shop itself as a vantage point. He had connections, people who owed him favors, people who knew how to stay unseen. He could make it happen. Amiri listened, arms crossed, her jaw tight, her thoughts moving just as quickly. It made sense. It was smart. It was necessary. But it also meant escalation. It meant war, and she knew what happened to people who waged wars against men like J-Roc. Marcus saw the hesitation flicker across her face, brief but there. He didn't push, not yet. He just let the plan sit between them, heavy and real, waiting for her to decide. Later that afternoon, she stepped out for air, needing space to think, to breathe. The city stretched in every direction, full of stories, full of lives moving forward even as hers felt locked in place. That's when she saw him, John Carter, the journalist. He was older now, the years lined across his face, but his eyes were just as sharp, just as hungry for truth. He had spent a lifetime digging into the things people wanted buried, uncovering rot beneath polished surfaces. His name had once carried weight, but time and politics had pushed him to the fringes, where stories no longer made headlines but still deserved to be told. She hadn't planned to approach him, but something in the way he stood, scanning the street with the instinct of a man still looking for the next big break, made her pause. The conversation started cautious, testing the waters. He knew about J-Roc. Everyone did. But knowing and proving weren't the same. When she told him what was happening, how the pressure was mounting, how businesses were folding under the weight of threats and violence, something in him reignited. He wanted to help. Not with newspapers, not with articles nobody read anymore, but with something real, his voice. He had a podcast now, small but steady, a place where people still listened, still cared. He offered her a space to speak, to tell the story from the inside. If the cops wouldn't act, if the city wouldn't move, maybe the people would. It was an opportunity. It was dangerous. It was exactly what she needed. But just as quickly as one door opened, another slammed shut. That night, Iron Root felt emptier. The absence of Nia was a weight that pressed against the walls, making the space feel colder, lonelier. She had been there from the start, from the first day Amiri had opened the shop, from the first cut, the first customer. They had built this place together, a foundation stronger than blood, but fear had a way of cracking even the strongest bonds. She hadn't said much when she left. Just that she couldn't risk it. Not for herself, not for her family. She had a daughter. She had too much to lose. Amiri understood. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. Now it was just her and Marcus, standing in the empty shop, the echoes of everything unspoken stretching between them. The war had already begun. There was no turning back. Marcus worked fast, precise, the way only a man trained to operate in the shadows could. Surveillance wasn't just about setting up cameras, it was about being patient, about knowing when to move and when to stay still. He had studied Burns and J-Roc's patterns, their meetings, their habits. He had learned which spots they felt safest in, where they let their guard down just enough for arrogance to slip through. That's how he got it, the recording. The audio crackled in his earpiece, every word sharp, undeniable. Burns' voice came first, low but clear, frustration lacing his tone. He wasn't happy. J-Roc had pushed too far, made too much noise. The fire, the shattered glass, the public displays of power, it was getting reckless. Burns had kept the streets clean for him, kept the real heat off his back, but now the pressure was building. People were talking. Whispers had turned into murmurs, and murmurs could turn into problems. Then J-Roc responded, and his voice carried something uglier, something raw. He wasn't scared. He didn't take orders. He made them. And if Burns wanted to keep his pockets lined, if he wanted to keep playing this game, he'd better remember who the real power in the city was. Marcus didn't need more than that. The recording was gold, a bullet loaded and ready to fire. He transferred the file, sent it to Amiri without a word. She'd know what to do next. She met Carter in a small cafe on the east side, a place where the scent of burnt coffee clung to the air, where conversations drowned under the hum of an old jukebox playing songs no one had requested. He listened with the same sharp attention as before, his fingers drumming against the chipped wooden table as she played the recording. When it ended, he sat back, exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing with thought. This wasn't just a story. It was a weapon. But weapons had to be used carefully. If they leaked it wrong, it would disappear. If they went through official channels, it would get buried. Burns had friends in all the right places, and J-Roc had fear on his side. This had to be loud, undeniable, a wildfire spreading before anyone could stomp it out. The podcast wasn't enough. They needed reach. They needed people to see it, to hear it, to believe it. Amiri made the call. A contact from her past, someone she hadn't spoken to in years but who owed her more than she ever asked for. A producer at one of the independent news stations, someone who didn't take bribes, who didn't flinch when the pressure got heavy. Within hours, the plan was set. The recording would be aired. Not hidden behind paywalls, not buried in small-time reports, but blasted out, loud and clear. That's when she felt it, the shift. J-Roc had always been composed, dangerous but controlled, a man who thrived on power through intimidation, not desperation. But now, as she stepped outside Iron Root that evening, she saw it in his stance, the way his fingers twitched at his sides, the way his jaw clenched just a second too long before he spoke. He wasn't just sending messages anymore. He was unraveling. He stepped closer, too close, his breath sharp, his body rigid. His voice came in a low growl, a warning wrapped in a promise. This wasn't business anymore. This wasn't about money or territory. This was personal. For the first time, he wasn't telling her to pay up. He was telling her to run. The phone rang just past midnight, the kind of call that carried weight before a single word was spoken. Amiri stared at the screen, the blocked number glowing in the dark. She let it ring once, twice, a third time before answering. The silence on the other end stretched too long, the kind that made her grip the phone tighter, muscles tensing before the words even hit. The voice was smooth, almost casual, as if discussing the weather. It told her she had a choice. Walk away now, let things go, pretend none of this ever happened. Or don't, and watch Iron Root burn with her inside it. The line went dead before she could respond, but the message stayed, settling deep in her bones like something cold, something final. She sat there, phone still in hand, heart hammering against her ribs. It wasn't an empty threat. J-Roc wasn't playing games anymore. She had pushed him, challenged him, humiliated him. Now he was making it clear that this wasn't about money or control, it was about her. About erasing her, about making an example out of her so no one else would dare step out of line. For the first time since this started, real fear crept in, whispering in the back of her mind that maybe, just maybe, this fight wasn't one she could win. The weight of it settled in her chest, a crushing pressure she hadn't felt in years. She thought of everything, of Nia leaving, of Marcus warning her this would get worse, of Burns lurking in the shadows, of J-Roc standing too close, daring her to break. She thought of the shop, of her mother's picture on the wall, of the long nights and early mornings spent building something real, something that mattered. She thought of how easily fire could erase it all. Marcus found her like that, sitting at the counter, the glow of the shop's neon sign flickering against her skin. He didn't ask what happened. He could see it in her face. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, waiting, giving her space to speak, to think, to make the decision he knew was weighing on her. When she finally exhaled, the sound was heavy, filled with something raw. She told him about the call. About the way the voice had sounded so sure, so final. About the fire she could already smell in the back of her mind. Marcus didn't react the way she expected. No anger, no shock, no immediate reassurances. Just a slow nod, as if he had been waiting for this, as if he knew this moment was coming. He reminded her why she started this fight. Why she stood her ground when others backed down. Why she refused to let J-Roc own this street, this shop, this part of her. He told her that fear was the last weapon they had, the final push before control slipped through their fingers. That she had already won more than she realized, that they wouldn't be threatening her this hard if she wasn't a real problem. She wanted to believe him. But belief didn't stop fire. The next morning, something shifted. People started talking. At first, whispers, then murmurs, then something louder. The news had spread. The threats, the intimidation, the fire waiting to happen. Carter had done his job well, pushing the story out, forcing people to pay attention. The podcast had been one thing, but now it was bigger. It was on the radio, in the papers, spreading across social media. And it wasn't just outsiders watching. It was the neighborhood. The people who lived here, who worked here, who had seen too many businesses disappear under the weight of men like J-Roc. They started showing up. Not in crowds, not in protests, but in quiet acts of defiance. A man stopped by just to say he had heard. A woman dropped off coffee, a silent show of support. An older neighbor sat outside on a folding chair, watching, present, unshaken. It wasn't much, but it was something. And that something was enough to remind her she wasn't fighting alone. Burns moved first, faster than she expected, pushing his last card onto the table before the floor caved beneath him. He stood in front of the cameras with the confidence of a man who had rewritten the truth too many times to doubt himself, his voice calm, measured, carrying the weight of authority that made people listen even when they shouldn't. He painted her as the problem, the agitator, the one who escalated things beyond control. He spoke of reckless accusations, of a business owner who had refused police help, of a woman who had brought chaos to her own doorstep and now wanted to cry victim. He laid it out neatly, the way men like him always did, twisting facts just enough to blur the lines between truth and fiction, planting doubt before the real questions could be asked. Amiri watched from behind the counter, the screen on her phone glowing with the live broadcast, her fingers tightening around the edges. He was good. He had done this before. He knew exactly which words to use, which tone to take, which facts to twist just enough to seem plausible. If she hadn't been ready, if she hadn't had proof, it might have worked. But this time, Burns wasn't holding the biggest weapon in the room. She was. Carter had timed the release perfectly. The moment Burns finished his speech, the recording hit the airwaves. Not just a leak, not just a whisper of corruption, but a full-blown public execution of his career, his credibility, his carefully curated persona. The voice that had spent years bending reality to fit his needs was now turned against him, playing across news stations, blasting through car radios, looping on social media feeds. Every word was clear, undeniable. His deals with J-Roc, his promises of protection, his complicity in the violence he had sworn to prevent. He had buried cases, ignored crimes, made sure the right people never got caught. And now, it was all out in the open, impossible to spin, impossible to silence. The reaction was immediate. The press turned on him like sharks scenting blood, voices rising, questions firing like bullets. He tried to backpedal, tried to control the damage, but the ground was already crumbling beneath him. He wasn't just losing the public. He was losing the badge that had shielded him for years, the allies who had stood beside him when it was convenient, the system that had protected him until the cost became too high. And worst of all, he was losing the one thing men like him valued most, power. But the real storm wasn't coming from the cameras. It was coming from the streets, from the places where loyalty wasn't built on contracts and policies but on survival and debt. J-Roc had played this game long enough to know when a piece had fallen out of place, when the balance had shifted against him. Burns had been useful, a bridge between power and corruption, a guarantee that the right doors stayed locked. Now, he was a liability, an open wound bleeding secrets that could spread too far, too fast. Amiri knew what that meant. Burns wasn't just a man losing his job. He was a man who had just become disposable. And disposable men didn't last long in this city. J-Roc paced the dimly lit back room of the bar, his fists clenching and unclenching, his breath coming in sharp, measured bursts, the kind that barely contained the storm brewing beneath his skin. The walls felt too close, the air too thick, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him like a vice. Burns had played his part well for years, keeping heat off the block, making sure the right cops looked the other way, making sure the game ran smooth. But now, all of that was gone, burned to the ground by one mistake, one slip, one recording that had flipped the city on its head. J-Roc had seen the headlines, heard the clips, watched Burns stutter and sweat under the spotlight, trying to claw his way out of the noose tightening around his neck. And now, every eye that had once been blind was wide open. The cops weren't just sniffing around, they were coming. He slammed his fist into the side of the wooden table, sending an empty glass crashing to the floor, the shatter barely cutting through the pounding in his skull. Burns had ruined everything. The streets were talking, his boys were watching, waiting, wondering if the empire he had built was already crumbling beneath his feet. And worst of all, they were asking a question he couldn't afford: was J-Roc still in control? Burns sat across from him, hunched, sweat beading along his temple, his usual arrogance stripped away, leaving only the raw edges of a man who knew the walls were closing in. His hands trembled against the sticky tabletop, fingers twitching like he was still trying to work out a way to spin this, to turn it back in his favor. But there was no spinning it. No deals left to make. No badges left to hide behind. "You sold me out." J-Roc's voice was low, steady, but dangerous, the kind of quiet that came before something violent. Burns flinched but tried to hold his ground, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting toward the exit as if calculating his chances. He swallowed hard, shaking his head, desperation slipping into his voice, trying to regain ground that had already crumbled beneath him. He didn't get far. J-Roc moved fast, slamming a hand against Burns's chest, shoving him back against the chair with enough force to make it scrape against the floor. The bar fell silent, the air thick with the kind of tension that made men hold their breath. Burns wasn't a cop anymore. He was a man without a shield, without backup, without anything but the mess he had made. J-Roc leaned in close, voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut. "You were supposed to keep this clean." Burns tried again, his words coming too fast, too thin, excuses tumbling out like loose change. But J-Roc wasn't listening. It was too late for words. Across town, Amiri sat in the dim light of her shop, the glow of the television casting sharp shadows against the walls, her fingers curled around a cooling cup of coffee she hadn't taken a sip from in over an hour. Her name flashed across the screen, her face alongside headlines that blurred between victory and warning. She had done it. The truth was out. Burns was falling. J-Roc was scrambling. The city was watching. And yet she felt no relief. Because this wasn't over. She had spent enough years knowing how men like J-Roc worked, how power shifted when fear took hold, how desperation turned to recklessness. He wouldn't go quietly. He wouldn't just disappear. He would come back swinging harder, meaner, with nothing left to lose. And when he did, she had to be ready. The air inside the courthouse was stale, thick with the weight of too many whispered deals, too many men who thought themselves untouchable. Burns stood in the center of it, his hands cuffed, his uniform stripped from him, leaving nothing but a hollow man in an off-the-rack suit, the kind they threw on criminals when they paraded them in front of cameras. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin, bitter line, his jaw locked tight as the judge read out the charges. Conspiracy. Corruption. Aiding and abetting organized crime. Each word landed like a hammer, but Burns barely flinched. He had spent too many years playing this game to believe that one bad hand could take him out for good. His eyes scanned the room, searching for something, someone, a sign that all was not lost. He found it in the back, where two men in suits stood against the far wall, silent, unreadable, their presence too deliberate to be casual. They weren't here for justice. They were here to make sure the mess didn't spread. Burns exhaled slowly, letting his gaze flick to Amiri, standing just past the reporters, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. He smirked, the same arrogant curve of his lips he had worn 100 times before, even now, with chains around his wrists. He didn't need to say it. The system wasn't broken. It was built this way. Amiri didn't react. She had spent too much time around men like Burns to be surprised. He was right about one thing: this fight wasn't over. But today he had lost. And she wasn't about to let his loss mean nothing. Outside, the world moved fast. Headlines rolled across the news cycle, reporters camped outside the station, the city caught in the aftershock of watching one of its own fall. But while they chased the scandal, something else was happening in the shadows. J-Roc was gone. No one saw it happen. There was no dramatic shootout, no last stand, no messy public display. One day, he was on the street, making noise, spitting threats, still convinced he was untouchable. The next, he had vanished. No body. No witnesses. Just silence where his name used to be. Amiri heard the rumors first. He had been taken out by his own people. Someone higher up had decided he had become a liability. Maybe it was the heat from the cops. Maybe it was the chaos his recklessness had caused. Maybe it was just the natural order of things. Men like J-Roc didn't get to retire. She didn't ask questions. It wasn't her fight anymore. Royal Roots still stood, its windows replaced, its walls repainted, its doors still open to the people who had always called it home. The streets felt different now, quieter, but not safer. Power didn't just disappear. It shifted, found new hands to hold it, new faces to wear its weight. There would always be another Burns. Another J-Roc. Another fight waiting to be fought. But today, for the first time in a long time, Amiri let herself breathe. The familiar hum of clippers, the rhythmic snip of scissors, the scent of coconut oil and shea butter filling the air, Royal Roots was alive again. The sign outside flickered, but it still stood, casting its neon glow across the sidewalk, a symbol of resilience, of survival, of a battle fought and won. The chairs were filled, laughter echoing off the walls as customers chatted, as hands twisted curls into tight braids, as the heartbeat of the neighborhood pulsed through every inch of the shop. The fear that had once clung to this place like a shadow was gone, replaced by something steadier, something stronger. People weren't just coming in for a haircut. They were coming to reclaim their space. The streets outside weren't the same. There were still scars, boarded-up windows on buildings that hadn't been as lucky, a few missing faces that wouldn't return. But there was movement, a slow return to normal, a cautious hope in the way neighbors greeted each other, in the way children ran past without glancing over their shoulders. The weight that had pressed down on this place had lifted, not completely, not forever, but enough to breathe. Enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had won something real. Amiri worked without pause, her hands moving with precision, her mind never quite resting. The fight had taken something from her, carved new lines into her face, left bruises that ran deeper than skin. She felt them in her bones, in the way exhaustion settled in places that wouldn't shake loose. But as she looked around the shop, as she caught the eye of Marcus leaning against the doorway with that knowing smirk, as she saw the pride in the faces of the people who had refused to back down, she knew the truth. It had been worth it. The chime above the door rang, soft but insistent, and for a moment, the sound sent a shiver through her, an echo of the past, of the first time J-Roc had walked through those doors like he owned the place. But it wasn't him. It never would be again. Instead, it was a kid, barely 17, hood pulled low, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He hesitated just past the threshold, his gaze darting around like he expected someone to throw him right back out. The shop quieted, not completely, but enough for the tension to settle in the air. Everyone knew who he was. He had been one of them, one of J-Roc's boys, standing on the corner, running errands, laughing at the same threats that had once haunted this place. But now he stood alone, no crew behind him, no swagger in his step. Just a kid with too many ghosts, with nowhere left to go. Amiri set down her comb, wiped her hands on a towel, and met his eyes. He swallowed hard, shifting his weight like he was trying to find the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice barely carried. "I need a job." The room stayed silent, waiting, watching. Marcus shifted, arms crossed, unreadable. Nia, who had returned days ago, looked skeptical, but she said nothing. This wasn't their call to make. Amiri studied the boy, saw the fear beneath the bravado, the exhaustion beneath the guilt. He wasn't here because he wanted to be. He was here because he had nowhere else left to turn. She reached behind the counter, grabbed the spare broom, and held it out. "You start at the bottom," she said, voice even, steady. "And you earn the rest." For a second, Trey didn't move. Then, slowly, cautiously, he took the broom. The tension cracked, not completely, not all at once, but enough for the noise to return, for the shop to move again, for life to keep pushing forward. Later, long after the last customer left, after the chairs were stacked and the lights dimmed, Amiri stepped outside. She turned, looking through the window, at the place she had fought for, at the people who had stood beside her, at the girl in the glass staring back at her. She had changed. But so had everything else. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.